All right, guys, so we're going to look at Sylvia Plath's poetry here. I started you off with Morning Song because Morning Song, all of her poetry that I've chosen for you is autobiographical. Morning Song was written after the birth of her daughter, and essentially what it describes is the inability of the mother figure, the speaker here, to connect with this infant child. She has no motherly instincts. She has no understanding of this thing that she's made as a sort of a human being. And as you read through the poem, she goes from a sense of alienation to a sense of a sort of acceptance or intimacy with the child. So essentially what she says is we have a lot of imagery here that is sound-based. And sound is sort of the key motif throughout this piece. And she's basically starts by talking about this child brought into the world and how your bald cry took its place among the elements. So you came into existence and there was this cry. And so think about the fact that the speaker is talking to her child and she's saying these very harsh things. And she says, our voices, the people in the room, they magnified your arrival. They echoed like a new statue. You were a new statue, she says. And so when you think of the image of a statue, think of how empty and hollow it is. It doesn't have life. It's not real. It's not human. And that's what she's comparing the child to. She says the room was like a drafty museum. And your nakedness shadows our safety. We stand round blankly as walls. So she says, there was no action or instinct on my part as your mother. I did not understand what to do. I did not feel any connection with you. And we have these functional illusions throughout here, this museum and this watch. And so it's very bare and stark, the imagery that she brings in. And she says, I'm no more your mother than the cloud. And she brings this image of how this cloud looks into a mirror to see itself being whisked away by the wind. And she's saying, my mother, I'm not your mother because I feel no more real affection than sort of the reality of this cloud that is being distilled into nothingness. That's what her affection is. And she says, all night your moth breath. So again, we have the sound of the child's breath that flickers. She says, I wake to listen, a sea moves in my ear. So here in the fourth stanza, we have sort of a shift happening. So the first night, the child, she's listening to the breath, the life force, to see that the breath is still there. And so it's becoming almost more human. And as she wakes to listen, something moves in her ear, something changes. It's a white noise, it's not a real understanding of her as sort of a human being, but something is changing. And then this cry happens. So again, the sound, distinctive sound, one cry happens as she jumps out of bed. And she says, essentially, that the cry leads to this sort of beautiful new understanding of this child as a human being. There's an intimacy that wasn't there when the poem started. And she says, the handful of notes become like the clear vowels rising like balloons. So in the simile, we have the understanding that the vowels rise like balloons. They come from the child as almost attempt at human speech. And because she attempts a human speech, in a sense, in the mother's eyes, that makes her human. So there's a change from the empty echo of this bald cry to the vowels of this human-like speech that makes her understand her child. So I'm going to go next to Daddy, and then I'll come back to Lady Lazarus. So if you'll flip over to 629, Daddy is a very complex poem. And essentially what it is, again, biographically understanding her father. Her father died when she was very young, 10 years old. And her father was born in Poland, lived in Germany during the wars, and then during the wars, we have found out recently with scholarship that with FBI files that he was actually, these uncovered FBI files recently, that he was actually being investigated for pro-German sympathies by the FBI. So it kind of adds another layer to our understanding of this poem, and you'll see why when we get to sort of the middle section. So essentially the structure here is it's messy, it's intense, it's chaotic. There is a structure, as you can see. There's clear stanzas, and there are end rhymes. There is enjambment. There's a lot of different things that she's doing, a lot of repetition. And the voice, the speaker's voice here is free verse. It's very much like a rambling stream of consciousness. So she's, again, speaking to her father here. And she starts with this understanding of how she sort of lived under her father's shoe. She says in his shoe, like for 30 years. Without daring to breathe. So basically without daring to disturb his memory. And there are arguments that, again, this could also be phallic imagery. That is one of the arguments kind of associated with Freud here. And she says, Daddy, I had to kill you. So again, a metaphorical imagery, but she says, I had to kill the image of you essentially in my head and remake you. And so she talks about how he died. She brings up this image of sort of his body in the ocean. So she says, I had to kill you, but I used to pray to recover you. So we have this love-hate relationship with the body of the father, where she at once loves it, but hates it, wants it, but wants to get rid of it at the same time. And she says, ach du, which is you in German. So this is an allusion to her father's German heritage. And we go into this section here that alludes to World War II. And again, this is post-World War II, we have postmodern literature for the first time here. She's really alluding to something that is becoming common and nomenclature in regular American culture. And that's really significant here. So she talks about the wars. Everyone knows which war she's talking about and what's happened. And so she talks about how her father is essentially so anonymous and so unknown to her that she couldn't pick him out. She didn't know the town he's from. She doesn't know his language. It's all foreign in what she's saying. Ich, ich, ich. She's almost like trying to stutter to speak to him, but she can't connect with him. And she's saying, I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you. And then she goes into this imagery of this sort of allusions to the Nazi Germany and to the Jews, and she compares herself essentially to the Jew. And so she is the image of the victim, whereas her father becomes the image of the tyrannical Nazi. And what she says is, I've always been scared of you. And she brings up her what she calls her gypsy ancestry in the tarot card. So she's saying, I never knew you, I never was of you, I never looked like you. And she brings up his sort of perfect Aryan, in what the Aryan sense was, blue-eyed blonde hair was the image of the, what was supposed to be beautiful in Nazi Germany. And she said, I don't look like you, ergo I never was a part of you, I never understood you, and it was all, as she says, gobbledygoo. And then she goes into some really, she broadens it out to sort of an understanding of how these figures, her father and soon to be her husband is brought in, are really images of the patriarchy. And she's saying how women are under the foot of the patriarchy here. And she says, mockingly, every woman adores a fascist, a boot to the face. So she's saying we punish ourselves by being a part of this institution of marriage and of patriarchy and taking part in this. We're really keeping ourselves abused and as a societal whole, is what she's essentially saying to women. And then she has this idea of her father standing at the blackboard. He's a professor. And she says, you were handsome. And she says, but no less a devil. So you can take that in two senses. You can say it as a handsome devil, of course, as one sense, but also has a dual meaning in the sense that she's saying you are a figure of evil to me as well. And then she brings up her own suicide, and she connects these ideas of death. So she says, I was 10 when they buried you, and 20 when I tried to die to get back to you, but they pulled me out. They stuck me together with glue. And so she's saying, I became whole again because I died. So she's saying essentially that death was a sense of rebirth for her, and it created a new understanding. It says, and then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with the Mein Kampf look. So again, this is an allusion to Hitler's Mein Kampf. And she says, I made a new image of you, whether she means her father, a new image of what her father was in her mind, but also an image of, and so she brings up this idea of torture. She relates the idea of being in love with rack and screw as a torture device to I do. So she brings up this idea of marriage as a form of torture. And again, her husband, not only he cheated on her, which led to her first suicide, or one of her suicide attempts. So she says, I've killed one man, I've killed two. So if I killed you, Dad, I've also killed the husband image in my mind. So she survived the suicide because her husband left her, and she's created this new sense of self. And essentially she's killed off the forces that were trying to obstruct her growth and her power. So that's why she says there's a stake in your big fat black heart, which is a vampiric imagery that she brings up. Okay, so now we're going to move to Lady Lazarus. Lady Lazarus relates to this because not only did she bring up the idea of suicide, but she also brings up a lot of images and issues with the patriarchy and the institution of marriage in general. And I'm going to get to that again in the Applicant in just a second. But Lady Lazarus is a different structure. It's 28 tercets, which are 3 lines each, and it moves at a very quick pace. It's almost has almost a regular sort of beat and frenzy to it. And you'll see that kind of build. So Lady Lazarus, of course, Lazarus is an allusion to Lazarus from the Bible, who Christ raised from the dead. And so this is about her suicide attempts. And she says, I have done it again. So this is post-suicide attempt. She says, 1 year in every 10 I manage it, a sort of walking miracle. So she's almost mocking the fact that it's just happened so many times and she's survived it. And she makes a sort of a joke about the fact that she'll do this like a cat. And she says, I'll do this once every 10 years, and the cat, like a cat, I have 9 times to die. So that will get me to 90 is what she's saying. And she says, I've come back to life as bright as a Nazi lampshade. And this is a horrific, dark image because the skin of Jews were sometimes made into objects like lampshades in Nazi Germany. It's horrific imagery, and she's making light of it, which is what is so dark and twisted about this poetry. And she says, do I terrify? So she's kind of mocking the people that saved her. And she says, essentially that the grave cave 8 will be at home on me. So she's saying that the flesh, that the cave that Lazarus was born with, the sort of sickened flesh is on her. And I, she says, I'm a smiling woman, only 30. So she says, this is number 3. And what a trash to annihilate each decade. So we have this, again, this almost mocking tone. And this crowd, she says, comes in to see, and the knocks me out. There's a charge. And she's talking here about the charge, the electric shock therapy that she received in her mental institution when she was placed in there after a suicide attempt. And she says, there's a charge for all these different things, for the eyeing of my scars, for the hearing of my heart, a very large charge for a word or touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So she's saying she's this object on display. She's just something to be made again, but not really made into herself. And then she goes into something that a lot of people see as sort of a feminist illusion. And she goes into this German imagery here that kind of extends to the end of the poem. And that's important because we're tying this back again to her father with a German ancestry and daddy. So it's a really interesting connection to make. She says, so Doctor. So she's saying a male doctor, enemy. So in a sense, the male and the doctor, people trying to get her better, and the patriarch are both enemies here. And she says, we have this incredible imagery. She says, I melt into a shriek. I turn and burn. I do not think I underestimate your great concern. So we can have this almost beat happening over and over again. And she says, ash, ash, you poke and stir, flesh and bone, there's nothing there. And again, this is another allusion to a horrific Nazi practice, which was, making these objects, these cakes, these soaps. And they would use their remains and put these objects and find these objects from the remains in the gas chambers amongst the soap and keep them. So she's saying they're basically essentially looting her. They're using her and they're taking her advantage of her. And this is an image that she's widening to the understanding of sort of feminist understanding of gender relations during the 50s and into the 60s. But she says, there's a twist. Out of the ash, like a phoenix, she says, I will rise with my red hair, again, phoenix imagery, and I eat men like air. So even though they try to take control or value of her body, they try to take ownership of it. In her death, she's rising again and becoming something of sort of this force to be reckoned with. And she says, I eat men like air, which is, again, a powerful simile. Okay, the very last one that I have here is the applicant. So the applicant is very explicitly about the institution of marriage, and it's incredibly critical of it. And essentially she's saying, this really gets to the heart of what I'm trying to get at when I talk about the 50s and the 60s, and that image of the perfect little family was not real. And so she talks about how empty marriage really is. And she's saying, first, the applicant is a nameless, faceless male who's applying essentially for a partner. And it says, first, what sort of person are you? Do you wear glass eye, false teeth? What do you wear? How much of you is made up? How are you constructed? You're not real. You're not an embodiment of humanity. You are empty, is what she's saying. And when they bring up this sort of idea of male and female anatomy, you get the sense that this applicant could go for male or female partner. So it's a really interesting image that she puts forth of sort of bisexuality. And So, she says, what is missing? And you know, how can we give you a thing? Stop crying, open your hand. Empty, empty, here is a hand. So she says, your hand is empty, there's nothing in it. So here is a hand to fill it and willing. So the wife image is brought forth, and it's an exchange. It's a object exchange where the wife is nothing more than something to be made and created at the hand of her husband. And it says is willing to do all these, bring you teacups, roll your headaches, whatever you need it. Will you marry it? It is guaranteed to thumb your eyes shut, essentially, to close your eyes when you die and dissolve of sorrow. So it does not exist other than to be around its husband. So its existence will end at the death of its husband. So that's what she's critiquing, this idea is that the woman lives to, quote unquote, serve the husband. And so she says, I notice you are stark naked. How about the suit? So the man is made into something that is clothed, and he is his suit. So that's his identity to us. So he's nothing more than his maleness, essentially. And then she goes into this the image of the female. She says, now your head, excuse me, is empty. And she says, so essentially the male's head is empty. She says, I have a ticket for that. Come here, sweetie, out of the closet. So she brings out the woman, or the speaker brings out the woman, and she says, well, what do you think of that? She's empty, naked as a paper to start. So a paper doll. She's literally nothing more than a toy or an object for the man to control. So even though the man is empty and hollow, he's at least got agency in his own being. The woman is nothing more than an object to do the bidding and the will at her husband. She doesn't even come into life or into being until he brings her into being. So it says, in 25 years she'll be silver and 50 gold, a living doll. So this is a very harsh phrase. It's really characterizing the empty nature of the woman's role in marriage as an institution. It says, it can sew, it can cook, it can talk. So it's not a she, it is an it. It is an object, it is not human. And she says, it works, there's nothing wrong with it. And she goes into these ideas. She says, my boy, it's your last resort. Will you marry it, marry it, marry it? So we have this almost sales pitch happening. It's false. It's made up of sort of a sense of lies. So she's really going after this institution of marriage, and it's everything about this is sterile and empty and not real. And that's what she's saying marriage is. It's dehumanizing. It's false, and it's not real. So you are free to move on to your next assignment. I hope you enjoyed Sylvia Plath. She's really fascinating and an incredible writer.